so mysterious? Just sit down and hang with us. Why so mysterious?
This is Why So Mysterious, the podcast where we attempt to fill the gap between the bodies we have and the lack of knowledge around them,
We're sharing our experiences and answering our own questions
with some help along the way.
to destigmatize tricky, taboo topics.
The triple Ts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Why So Mysterious. I'm Raven,
And I'm Sada.
and today we are talking to Renee. And now I forgot the phonetic way to say your last name. Why don't you just say your last name real quick for the people?
Renee Kokts-Porietis.
Thank you.
Kokts-Porietis. It actually is like easy to say, but when you look at it, you're like,
Don't look at it.
I'm
Just
gonna
don't.
fumble.
You're totally right. When
I'm
you
gonna
explained that
fumble.
to me, don't look at it.
Yeah.
I was like, well, how can I not look at it and just say it? But now that I know, that's exactly right. So, Renee Kokts-Porietis is the co-founder and chief operating officer of My Normative, Inc. Before starting My Normative, Renee specialized in epidemiological research that was grounded in women's health. Her research interests have ranged from the impact of the menstrual cycle on sport performance outcome to how lifestyle factors such as physical activity and chronic conditions are experienced by women in the health context. Okay, so to start out, it would be really awesome to get a little bit of your background. You're an epidemiologist with a focus on women's health, and I wanted to know, how did you kind of get into that, and how did it lead you to partnering with Danica, who we've already spoken to create My Normative? What was lacking that you felt like you needed to create there?
That's a great question, and it opens a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
But basically, I like to describe myself as a pseudo recovering academic. We joke, right? Whereas I started
I love
off,
that.
and I will admit that I still dabble. I haven't given it up completely, but we're recovering academics. And so I started off as a lonely undergrad student doing a summer project, and it was looking at the menstrual cycle and how that related to sports performance. And so they just kind of threw me in right to this topic, and I was like, this is great. And so I was helping out.
Oh, interesting.
And then I went to write my report, because you have to write little reports for those things.
Yeah.
And I could not find citations for any of the work we were doing. And so, of course, in all this scientific writing, you have to be like, somebody else did this, or somebody else looked at this, and be like, look it, we're not making stuff up. And I had such a hard time doing it because nobody knew anything about the menstrual cycle in sports or athletics or anything like that. And there was a few, but basically I was like, nothing there.
What year was
No.
that, if you don't mind me asking?
So there's an updated citation. So I looked into this. So as of 2017, 2018, there's still a huge dichotomy in the amount of female persons and male persons in sports performance research, and the reasons that they're not there, basically. So I went into my master's. I went into epidemiology, and I was like, this is supposed to be where big data is, and lots of participants and population.
Yeah.
And there is more, but it's still not taking into account a lot of things like the menstrual cycle, like gender, some of these things. And so you see a shift where it's okay, some people are really pioneering this area, but it's 2021, and it's really sad that area is still being pioneered at this point in history.
And it's still
precisely.
treated as niche, which is very frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where you hear it, I even say it too, right? I'm the common thread through all my research has somehow ended up being the uterus. So I looked at the menstrual cycle, I looked at endometrial cancer, and
Nice.
apparently where I'm I know what this is, and that's apparently a niche area because not many
people do. Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. Wow.
We've said this so many times to so many guests, but it's exactly why we started this podcast, and that's also exactly where the name comes from. It's just why, if 51% of the population of the world has this organ that affects all their other organs and everything else, is there no information on how it functions, what it does, what
even some of the hormones do.
Yeah.
You know, even down to like, I think the thing that got us started like a conversation with you guys was, I was saying to Danica, I was like, I don't understand why I read in an article that they don't actually understand what PMS is.
Yeah.
And then she was like, oh, well, yeah, it's because they don't understand what the hormones are doing. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I was like, how do we not know
Why
these
don't they know
things?
that?
Yeah. Like, and then she started breaking down. I was like, wait, we got to get you on the podcast. Because I was like, this is exactly why we started this.
Mm-hmm.
It's also quite close to why we started My Normative, right? So Danica and I were both in our masters around the same time, and we knew each other from sport and from rowing. And so we would go kind of work out and whatnot, and we both just complain about the state of things and going, why isn't there this? Or when you were trying to track your own health and you were like, why can't I? Like, I know that my menstrual cycle is like making more lactic acid at certain times and making things hurt more and making, like, I burnt more calories. Why are we not counting those? Like,
yeah, exactly. Why is it not tracking on my app?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's so interesting. And I think that's like, I think great things come from people who notice the lack of,
Certainly,
like, you know, just even eyes on an arena. It's like, that's usually where I think like really cool things can happen, because it's like, oh, like, I think it's so easy to just go about things and just continue as like, well, we'll just categorize females as 70% male. And then, you know, like, and we'll just, that's fine. Like, it's chill, whatever. But it's like, when then you are the female, you're like, well, I don't think that's correct. I was even just thinking today, I was like, there's so many times where I'm like, you know, whether it's the tracking app that you're using, or even just when you're trying to find like general information about, like, I was just Googling like how much water I should be drinking. And it was like, all females should be drinking 2.7 liters. And I was like, that cannot be true. There are people who are 5 feet tall, and then there are people who are 5'9", and they're both female, but their bodies are going to be very different and have different needs. And I was like, this just can't be. Like, why can't we have then a system that is just based off of maybe size instead of just a general, you know, whatever for females. But just even, that's kind of, that was just something recently where I was like, looking at it, I was like, I know this is so flawed. Like, this is just so silly, you know?
Yeah. There's a lot of that. The more you look, and like, I think the really obvious example that we often go to, and I like it because it's obvious and everybody goes, oh yeah, but I also kind of dislike it because it still brings female bodies back to pregnancy. But when you're pregnant and you track yourself and you track your health and wellness, you are getting fat and slow because you cannot be pregnant. That's not a possibility. You can't be growing another human or like growing all this other stuff. It's like there's no possible explanation for it.
Oh my gosh.
Mind blowing.
Yeah, that's actually
which is
so
wild
accurate.
too, because like pregnancy is like the one thing that there's so many resources for
Comparatively.
like the
Yes,
body
it's so true.
the body is only like you know, it only means something to anyone else if it's carrying another being, which is incredibly frustrating.
It is really frustrating.
Which is why I hate the example, but everybody goes, oh yeah. Totally. Whereas like if I say something about like the menstrual cycle or just like aging in general in the female population, people are like, does it really matter? And you're like,
it does.
Yeah.
It
yeah.
really,
God forbid
really
you
does.
mentioned perimenopause. Oh my God. Well, that's really cool. So you guys got together and decided to create like an app of all things. Why not just like a one study together or something like that? Why did you go like full force into creating a different kind of tracking mechanism?
And like this is a very kind of silly answer. So one, I will say that there, like, you saw it in like even just our friends who we either went working out or running with. Like, there are some great stories about people like wanting to quit running because they were at like that like one part in their cycle where I was like, are you just like pre-period? And they're like, no, that couldn't be it. And I was like, come back like one more time. And if you don't like running, if it's not for you, you don't have to do it. She's now running half marathons because she figured out that like that just like wasn't her best time. But so there is definitely the like knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, where it's like, let's just get this out of like the academic hands and into people's hands. But I will also say is that part of it was that there's not a female-centric data set out there.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more.
That's what we're going to talk about today.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah, so you're an epidemiologist, which Danica very pointed out, which is so true. Is like no one really, not no one, but very few people knew what that was pre-COVID. So
I'm sure. I thought we were dermatologists, like skin people, and I was like, that is the only positive thing that has come out of COVID-19 pandemic for us is that people actually know what this word is now.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Fantastic.
But
yeah, so just straight up for anyone out there who doesn't already know this, the female body, and that is just, anyone who's carrying a uterus, is not included in many clinical trials, all clinical trials until kind of recently, really, only in the last few decades. Like I read recently that like I think it was like the 1930s, they still weren't really using women cadavers in most medical schools unless they absolutely had to, because it was indecent to look at a naked woman who you weren't married to.
It's ridiculous.
And so, yeah, this is all like kind of new. But as I was putting together the questions for this, I, was reading a lot of articles and just like a lot of just random stuff on Healthline and even just WebMD. And it was either like no one is using the female body in these because they're so simple, they're being treated as 70% of a man, or they're so complicated because of hormones, they'll skew the data. And so that's why we're not using them. So in your professional opinion, are we too complicated or too simple to be included?
So in my personal opinion, we should just figure it out and include female persons. And that's kind of what's driven my own personal research. I mean, why don't we just look into this, and why don't we just demystify it, right? The two reasons that you brought up are actually the two most cited reasons. And in particularly the point around there's too much variability, and that's going to skew our results, and that's going to mess up our results. And this giant question mark in the middle of like your research or what you're trying to figure out is typically the one that's more and more cited. The new one that's coming, though, which is exciting because we're on to the third reasons why we can't include female persons.
Okay.
We don't have enough past research on them, so we don't know what's going on, which is just like,
come on.
You could just solve the problem by doing the research like, yeah. So those are kind of like the top three ones that get cited. It's getting better. And part of the reason it's getting better in like within the Canadian context is now if you want research funding from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, so like CIHR, the big funding body of Canada, you have to justify either why you are or not including both sex and gender in your research. So to get funded or to get money for it, at least through the public channels, you at least now have to like fess up and either be like, there has to be a good reason not to, or here's my reason why we're going to do it.
I read that when I was, going through all this stuff too, and I was like, oh, like good on them, that's awesome. But then I also read that there's still once you get that funding and you do your research, there still isn't any. Well, I shouldn't say any, because some people are doing it where it's applicable and some people aren't doing it, but it's totally kind of seems like up to the researcher, the research body. No one is analyzing by sex. So when they're taking this data, they're not figuring out the results based on sex. And so what issues is there when sex isn't a part of the final data?
So like the biggest thing that like, and this is like my like epidemiology brain coming out being like, the biggest thing I would be concerned about is this fancy word called modification, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is basically going, is the relationship of interest, right? So is our exposure or disease relationship the same in these two groups? And if it's not the same, then we should not just squish everybody together, because they're two distinct things and we need to be looking at them as two distinct things. And so like the point being like, we should check before you just make one giant group that that's okay. And I think that's the step that a lot of people miss. So I think a lot of people are putting effort and some energy into going, okay, well, to get funded and get my grant renewed and to build all this and actually be able to do it, sure, I need to talk about sex and gender and why that matters. But I think your point about follow through and after the funding comes in and the reporting on it, or even just like any mention is still limited, let's say it that way.
Is there any like, when you are, say, like, you know, setting up your trial or whatever, going for the funding, when it comes to sex, is there like, because what I've seen a lot of is like postmenopausal females. So like, is there regulation over sex when it comes to like, you know, it has to be
The age range.
Yeah, like the age range.
Yeah.
Or is it just like, because then I feel like that's like a little bit of a loophole you could go.
So
go
there's a
for.
couple loopholes that you notice. So
Good on ya.
one is definitely postmenopausal female persons. However, that is also like that assumption that postmenopausal female persons and male persons are that's actually not the same.
You know what's weird is I've never thought about it that way until you just said that. It's like they're
Yeah,
still
but
not the
that's
same.
why they're
Oh
like
my God.
categorizing them as they're just like, well, their hormones are basically just dropped off
They're
and
still
whatever.
not. Oh,
but they still
God.
have hormones going through their body.
Yeah.
And still different in like so many other pieces than just the hormones, right? So
The
like
hormones,
even just like the anatomy or like your body composition. So like how much fat to muscle mass to organs, to other things that you have, like so many things. So you see that where they just be like, let's just pretend hormones aren't a thing and just be like, they've gone through menopause. The other one you'll see is that they'll only research people when they're on their periods, because you are at the stablest hormone. You don't have,
just
it's
like
before estrogen comes up, it's before progesterone comes up. So you are similar, or at the most point where you're similar most to the male.
Oh my goodness.
That's so interesting. The most data that we have on the female body is during the period. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought? That's true, actually.
It's trying to figure out when are they less variable or when are, right? It's just brutal though. And you're like, okay, well, I'm only going to take Advil, or I'm only going to do this for these like couple days then? Like it doesn't apply to any other.
Yeah, exactly. It only, you know, I mean, that seems like it shouldn't be allowed. Like, it's not like we are just on our period all the time. So like,
Thank
I feel
goodness.
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously, thank goodness. So that data to me, as like just like a layman, like reading it, I'd be like, oh well, what about the other 3 weeks? Like, what happens to what's my like body gonna? How is my body gonna react when it's not on my period and instead it's
Then
raging?
you're too variable.
Yeah,
Can't see the air quotes.
Yeah, air quotes,
Heavy
yeah.
air quotes.
Heavy
So
air
then what do
quotes.
you think is like, you know, the reason that you and Danica started My Normative was to do this tracking app, to have a resource for people who wanted a better resource, but also to, you know, collect data for a data set that could be used in the medical community. So why don't you think more people are doing that? Like, what's stopping, you know, people from just like getting on with it and collecting this data that actually in some cases really is out there, just hasn't really been tapped into? And I will get into that in a second, but like what's the holdup?
I think there's a couple, right? So within the academic community, I'll say the ways in which you can collect information on the menstrual cycle are either really outdated and kind of heavily flawed, or they're really costly because you're doing actual like hormone analysis, and like you need either blood samples or saliva samples for that, and that's really expensive and also retrospective, right? You get your results 2 weeks later and you're like, 2 weeks ago you had this profile, how did you like it?
How did you feel?
How did you feel? It doesn't impact every day to day.
No.
And so I think that's really part of it, is that you are either going to use something that has a lot of like participant burden. So like take your temperature at the exact same time every single day. You don't get people to do that. It's just not going to happen. And also do it for like half a year. Like it's not reasonable to ask somebody to do that unless they've already kind of self-imposed. Or you're going to just get really messy data that's not actually usable. And you see that in a lot of studies where they throw out a lot of their data because somebody missed a day or two, and that was the critical day or two, and that month is gone.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So it's a big project.
Yeah.
I think there's the data collection methods, and also just not a lot of people, like, again, like it's not taught in standard classes, right? Like I went through my anatomy and physiology and we learned about pregnancy, but I don't remember ever learning about the menstrual cycle in those. That was university level courses.
Really?
Anatomy and physiology. And it's just not included.
No.
And so unless you seek it out.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that we've like noticed a lot is like if fertility and pregnancy have like that's where a lot of the focus on female basically anything is in the medical industry is like
where it's
if there's an
important.
issue with fertility or if there is a pregnancy, that's considered like, oh well, this is vital, we need to know. But then the rest of the time, like, you know, when you're menstruating, and the thing is there's so many things, there's so many like endometriosis, PCOS, there's so many conditions that go along with the menstrual cycle and could probably benefit a whole lot from knowing more about what's going on. But then it's really just, you know, fertility and pregnancy that everyone
focuses on.
Which is like, and it goes down to the classes. Like if you're not being taught about menstruation in class, then of course the importance is pregnancy, and it just kind of snowballs.
And like we just did a PMS episode recently too, and like the reason that we decided to do one was like we were kind of like, well, I mean, at first I was like, we're not going to do one on PMS because everyone like knows what PMS is, like who cares? And then as soon as we started looking into it, and also as soon as, again, Danica said that thing to Sada about how like, oh, we don't actually really know like why, it's like, hold on, everybody knows about PMS. Everybody, like it's made like a joke in television shows. There's billions of memes about PMS and like we don't know, we literally know, like there's no short list, I found out, and like every single symptom that could potentially related to PMS is on there, like things like nagging, that's on there. And it's like just
wild.
Is that a thing? Like how is this not, I don't know, possible? Something that's as universal as premenstrual syndrome is like just elusive.
Yeah, it's so wild. But thankfully we have people like you. So
one thing that I wanted to talk about too actually was that you know, obviously we said like female bodies routinely left out of medical studies. But I was reading some interesting things. Like one thing I know that is still not like industry that's not taken female bodies into account is the automotive industry. It's still male crash test dummies. Female bodies are still way more impacted by car accidents than male bodies. I did find out, I was like, well, why don't they make better dummies? Turns out it actually is very difficult to make a dummy. I realized that. We're still using dummies from the 1970s, I found out,
Really?
because they're so hard to make. Yeah. I mean, like, I still don't really think it's an excuse. There should be one in development at the very least.
Yeah,
but
at the very least.
Volvo specifically has been since I think the 80s collecting their own data on their own cars of what happens to everyone in a car accident. So children, men, and women. And they've been using that data to design their cars based on safety for all sexes, all sizes, all people. That's very interesting to me. And with something that's as common as a car accident, where actually there is a lot of data on like who was in the car accident, how did they get hurt, what was their height, what was their weight, all that stuff. Like, again, why do you think that no one is like tapping into that to like design better products for their customers? Like, this isn't something I would imagine where you need to go and like swab for hormones and get people spit.
I mean, yeah.
So I looked, I also, because I saw that question come through and I was like, I'm going to look into this just because it's not my area. So there is one female dummy out there.
Really?
And there was also a big debate on whether that they could actually give her breasts. And I was
What?
like, that's
Why?
kind of, universal or fairly universal
Really? Yeah.
female body.
Yeah.
But it made it much harder to actually make these dummies, to your point, where it's really, really tricky.
Was it because the breast tissue is hard to replicate or something?
It was just less consistent results because you didn't know how certain things were going to move. And I was like, that's kind of the whole point.
I roll.
Seriously.
Yeah. So there is one, but it is also like 4'11". Like it's
What? Whoa.
Yeah, right? And I was
very small.
you didn't go for like the average. You went for, they call it the 5% one, which is like the bottom 5% of the spectrum of what female bodies look like. And I was like, really?
Why would you make a dummy based on the bottom 5%? Is there a reason?
Because it's, I guess, so far from the female or the male.
What?
That they're like testing, like,
It's more
we'll
cost effective
test
to
the
make a
other
tiny
end.
one.
That's really weird.
So that one was really strange.
But I would
Yeah.
imagine that there's other industries too, like even hospitals, like, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of things that are in a hospital, like MRI machines or hospital beds or something like that. I am assuming here that a lot of those things are just designed with the averages in mind, but it's just like we have data that's easily collectible and things like something that's as common as a car accident or something like that. Or
So it's not the car accident that's hard to collect data on. It's the female person.
Yeah.
What you're wondering here is how they call it like anthropometrics, right? So like the hip angles, right? Which is something that's different or very classically different, the like female pelvis and hip angles.
Right. Yeah.
And how those are impacted by injury. That is what's not known. So how do you make the dummy when you don't know what to put in, right? What the, excuse me, this is gonna be really crass, but like what the breaking points are.
Right.
Yeah.
And why? Because that doesn't have to do with hormones. Like that is like you could, I don't know what type
That's
of
just
scan
bones,
you do.
isn't
That's
it?
just bones. Like how, why is it not progressed to the point where we have, like, of course, just like anything, an average angle of the hips,
I think we might have that. I think what is missing, and this is again just purely speculative, is a lot of it is who's in the room.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, speak to that.
Just like especially the automotive industry, which I'm imagining is like predominantly like male based.
Yep.
They'd just be like, yeah, this is fine. Like they wouldn't be like, oh, well, what about female hip angles, or what about breasts and how that interacts with seatbelts? Like it's just not going to come up.
No.
And I really hope that it was never done maliciously, but it's just, there's these spaces, so medicine, research, automotive, that were not dominated by female persons or female persons in leadership.
That's very true. And that was
Yeah.
also something that I was reading and getting ready for this, was that an article that was linked to another one that I was reading was the vast sort of like vacancy in STEM jobs. So what is it? Science, technology, what's the E? Electronics, maybe? Engineering and math. That's what it is.
Engineering, math,
Engineering
yeah.
and math. All of those kinds of jobs. I was like, electronics? That's wrong. I'm personally not in STEM, as you can tell. But how like a lot of female persons' bodies, what have you, are, and it has a lot to do with still female bodies kind of being the primary caregiver. So when a lot of them decide to have families, they don't end up coming back to their full-time STEM job that they had before. So a lot of women go into these jobs, but they don't stay there, for mostly having to do with, I'm just going to go ahead and say, gender inequality is just like, that's
probably
pretty typical. We do have paternal leave in Canada, but it's not used as much.
It could also be a representation of the industry. If it's a fast-paced industry, if they're coming back and if their employers aren't encouraging them to like, you know, come back and maybe they have to relearn a few things, but they're
Right.
still in the same position. Like there's a lot of the more psychological things.
Yeah,
I would
that's
I would
true.
think.
I think you both made a really polite assumption, assuming that equal hires get made at the beginning.
Oh, that.
Oh,
yeah, that,
yeah,
we didn't
that's
even
actually
think
so
of that.
true. That's actually so true.
We're
Yeah.
trying to be optimistic.
We're such
but,
a
Yeah.
we're optimists here.
but that is very true, and it does have a lot to do with like, you know, you can't be what you can't see. It's one of those kind of classic things
Yeah.
where it's just like there aren't really a lot of like men in those rooms who are really gonna, I think, consider that just because no one's brought it to their attention.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially not, like a lot of them aren't doing it through like malice or something. It's just like no one has really kind of sounded any alarm bell to say why this is so important. And what a bummer.
Yeah.
I think that there's some pretty crazy stats out there, and now I'm not going to know any of them because I've said this around, especially like in the medical field, of like who actually makes it. So like who gets funding and who gets whatnot. And so Canada just did a 10-year review of their sex and gender policy and research funding.
Yeah.
So heads up, only in 2009 did that actually, 2010 did that actually go into effect,
Wow.
which is not that long ago.
No.
And it's policy, right? So this is when I'm like, oh, you have to have answer these questions to get funded. That's what I'm talking about. Is that has only been around for
10 years.
enforced for 10 years or so.
Yeah. Right.
And so they looked at it, and yes, all these different fields have increased their kind of like commentary on it and like appropriate commentary. But one of the things they looked at was like if the principal investigator or primary investigator, the person that's leading the research, depending on their sex, how are they more or less likely to actually report and actually consider these things?
Oh, yeah.
So first, only 34% of the applicants that were successful were female. And you're going, that's a lot less than 50%.
Wow.
But okay.
Sure is.
It sure is. Yeah.
So there's that. And female primary investigators were much more likely to actually consider both sex and gender. And so you're going, why isn't it being considered? And it's going, it is. It's just there's a smaller group of people that are considering it.
Wow. Yeah.
And those are the ones that are apparently doing it well.
That's so frustrating.
I'm
so frustrated.
So frustrating.
So like, what do we do? It's like, it's not just
it's right
a
there.
women's issue. It's not just a female issue. It needs to be in everybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It needs to be everybody. And I don't know why it's still not. I mean,
and it's always that trickle down. It's like when you think, okay, well, at first our kind of frustration is like, why are the researchers not looking at the data? You know, like why are they not considering this?
Right.
But then it's like, well, who are the researchers? And then it's like, who gets the grant? And then who makes the policy? And then it's like, it just always goes further and further and further.
Goes all the way to the top.
And it's so frustrating. You're just like, and it's like, and I'm so for making the moves, like doing the things that, you know, press the boundaries and push people forward. But then it's like, you do always have to be looking at like, okay, well, I might apply for the grant because I have this amazing, you know, like clinical research that I'm going to do, but there's a smaller chance that I'm going to get it if I have a female name, even, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just so frustrating. I think we hit this wall all the time.
We do.
We hit this wall all of the fucking time.
The good news, the silver lining, just in case you were wondering, the thing that came out of that where I was like, this is good. Individuals who did appropriately address both sex and gender in their granting applications in Canada were more likely to get funded.
Cool.
Okay, well
that's good.
So like at least they're being, not to say rewarded, but at least they're being successful for their efforts.
Yeah.
And so at least that's nice to see, because if it was not the case, that would be super frustrating.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just get so frustrated with like how slow it is to do something that seems so obvious we should be doing, and then you just kind of have to remember that like it's not obvious to a lot of people, and that's sad. But I don't know, like what would you say, like would be like some really good first steps in the direction of like equality of, I would say, sexes in trials and then also sexes doing trials? Like, do you feel like there's like a couple things that you feel like are really obvious and potentially kind of easy that people maybe just haven't thought of or aren't doing? Any tips and tricks?
This is so not easy, but I think that the big one there is making it not just a female or woman's, right? So like there's like, it's not just that it hasn't happened for women. It's going also by squishing all these groups together, you actually might have missed something on the male side, right? And so especially there's certain like social pressures in healthcare, right? About like what men or males should or should not be doing, right? So like mental health is a big one on that side, where it's like there's not actually as much research over there because that's been taboo on that side, but not on the female side. So I think kind of waking up, and it's not just being like, oh, we have to catch up on the female side, but being like, no, this is an important characteristic that has health impacts or has other impacts. I always go to health as my default there, but
it encompasses a lot. That's fair.
This sounds really awful because it shouldn't matter, but your comment about like somebody's name, right? Like when
that's what I'm saying.
When I submit things, right? So whether that's journal articles or whatnot, you have a separate document that has your contact and your name on it than in your actual work.
Oh,
so whoever reviews your work won't see your name and can't take a guess.
Oh, wow.
And is that for that purpose?
I don't think so. I think it's so that people don't play favorites or don't have like competitive rivalries, because it's peer review.
Right.
But that's also how these grants go through, is peer review. And so I'm going, is it by topic area that people aren't getting funded because it's like female persons are more likely to look into female things? Or is it by, are they just not taking people's credentials off, kind of thing?
Right.
Interesting.
That's so weird.
Yeah, that is so weird. The things we don't know. This is what I'm like, I love this kind of stuff, because I'm like, it's so interesting, because it's like I was saying, like the layman's kind of reaction might be like the frustration, but then it's actually like there's so much more involved behind the scenes, obviously, like it makes sense.
And this truly is like, it's a human issue, like to your point about how, you know, like specifically like cisgendered men and mental health, like that's a really like taboo subject that's very caught up in stigma. And I'm pretty sure, aside from I think queer people, males still lead the amount of suicides in Canada every year, which
I think so,
I think that's still like the highest stat is cisgendered men. And it's just like, you don't know like where are your resources, and it's like that's kind of what we're screaming at over here as well, or just like, you know, not enough women in STEM or whatever. It's just like all of this is a human issue. We're all
it's
just
everyone's issue.
It affects everyone. Seriously.
Yeah,
so
it's so true.
God,
it's crazy.
It's really easy to be pessimistic in this space, and I fall into that trap a lot, in the sense of going like, fewer than 1,000 women have ever been, or female persons have ever been studying on how the menstrual cycle relates to strength training. And like,
really?
Right.
Yeah. Isn't that frustrating?
That's super frustrating.
But, and so like, it's easy to get something like that being like,
wow,
my master's project had over half that. Like, and so, it was just one of those where it's like, there's certain things that are really annoying or frustrating, or why hasn't we made progress? I will though say that within the last year, like within kind of 2020, 2021, the amount of like either calls to action or reviews kind of pointing out these gaps like has exploded. So I will say that like people are getting frustrated, and there's now just enough evidence out there to be like, we need to look into this more. And so it's frustrating that you don't have when is the best time to do resistance training, or when is the best time to do this, or how does estrogen relate to dopamine, which is fascinating, by the way, but like, we'll leave that. And so there's just like the starting of everything, but the starting of everything is like 15 people.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't say a lot if a study is based on 15 people.
Yeah.
No, you can't.
It's just
not
like
enough
the
data.
baby steps at the beginning. That's like, we did an episode a while ago on sports and menstruation. And I'm sure as an athlete, you'd probably familiar with how the women's national team for the States won the World Cup using period tracking data in their training program.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
It was so interesting. And at first I was like, oh yeah, I'll like do a little research on this. And like when I was telling it in the podcast, I was getting like so excited. Like it was just so, and I'm not a sports person at all, but I was like, this is so beautiful that they got like really into it. And yeah, they won the World Cup. And also the reason that then that sort of training regimen, even though it's just the beginning, same thing, it's a team of 23 people, so you could consider that a study, but it's very small, started getting implemented in all these other teams who were coached by men who started off being like really squeamish about the whole thing. But the reality is nobody likes to win more than cisgendered men. And so they were totally on board with it. And they just had to get over the hurdle of like, you know, we all have a lot of that baked into us at the beginning. And then you realize like, it's not that big of a deal. And it's also really important. So why not just go for it?
Do you think that had any like kind of, I mean, it's like sports. I feel like that kind of like gets everybody excited aside from like us, but
sometimes I get swept up in a moment.
So I'm like, do you think that had any effect on like, hey, there's something to look at here? Like if this team improved because they looked at it.
There was rumors, and I don't ever know if it was true, that I think it's the British cycling team, like who dominated for years, was doing, they call it sometimes like polarized training, right? So different training in different phases of their cycle.
Yeah.
And also some other countries, but nobody would publish on it because once you publish, it's in the public record.
What?
And it was their competitive advantage.
Oh.
That's so shitty.
That's so shitty.
That's actually so shitty. Oh man.
They couldn't just like keep it a secret, like well, no, you can't really keep that a secret, can you? It's just like
that seems like almost like that's my like non-sportsman person. I'm like, come on, like
seriously.
This could affect so many more people than just the sports, like. But I know people really like sports, so.
But that's also why it needs to be in places other than just competitive sports too. Like that's really like the broader thing, and everyone should be using it. It shouldn't just be like elite secret squirrel trophy winners.
That's so crazy. So, I mean, I think that can kind of maybe tie into a little bit. I want to talk just like last few minutes, just a little bit more about My Normative and what your goals are with like maybe even just that in mind.
We heard you have a new like a 2.0 system coming out soon.
It's coming so soon. I have it on my device because obviously we get an early look, but I'm actually so stoked on it. It's
awesome. Yes, I'm so excited.
Not to just like, you know, self-promote there.
No, do it. Please self-promote. I have the My Normative the first edition or whatever on my phone, so I'm excited to see the new one.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear you think. So early September is our release of that next version, and it's one of those where it's what I wanted the first version to be, but of course that's why you keep going and you keep progressing. But
been there. Definitely.
But I think the thing that we kind of just touched on was that it's not for the high performance athletes, or it's not for the person it's for the everyday person. Because just because you do rec soccer and not win, like kudos to the Canadian women's Olympic team who just won soccer, but like it still matters how you feel about yourself and how your body feels, and knowing that in the sense that this is my perception, but like a lot of people are afraid of failing or afraid of being bad at something, or not, like it's just not for me. And there's a lot of the kind of like negative emotions around physical activity, especially at the community level, I'll say.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
so-
especially at the female, for a lot
Yeah.
of females, it can be, an insecurity.
And so adding some context why you might be feeling that way, and that, hey, it could be temporary, and just give yourself a day and you could feel great. And I think that is what we really tried to capture in this next version, is more around the physical activity, more around the so what does it mean for you as a person, and not for the generic human that's 70% of a man that's in the research papers.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. Not for like whatever it is that something has told you you're supposed to be. And we talk about that all the time too, is just like tools to be able to, especially in the world that we're living in right now, and especially as people who are like, like professionals and like all that shit, is just like give yourself some grace. And a lot of us need to see the evidence, which I think is great, but also a little bit unfortunate to recognize that we can allow ourselves like a moment to breathe and a moment to not be like thinking about all the things that should be. And that is one really, really powerful thing about knowing your cycle and tracking your cycle, is just like there's a reason for most of how you're doing.
Yeah. And I think like what My Normative actually is offering is like a lot of people already do the tracking of like you track your period. Like say whether you're doing it for fertility or just to track it to know, so you know what kind of outfit to wear or what to expect or whatever.
Yep,
precisely.
Yep.
Like a ton of people track, but then I would say like a huge portion of those are just like tracking to know when their period's coming.
Yeah.
They don't know. There's no like your app isn't telling you, hey, like this kind of workout is going to be good for you today, or this might be why you're feeling not as motivated to do these things. And it's so interesting because at Revel, like we obviously like try to educate a lot with our social media, and we have this one post that I literally made that's like, here are your 4 phases. Like this is kind of like the simplest breakdown of like it's like a 28-day, like just like the 4 different phases or like 4 different weeks. And then just like I think I gave like the slightest symptoms of like some bloating or like like just like broke it down,
The classic ones.
That post has like 200,000 impressions of people being like, what? Like literally just like, excuse me?
Which is still like, I didn't even know there were phases until 2 years ago. Like this is all a new journey for me also.
Yeah, exactly.
It's wild. And
So
it's just all the time people are learning about it, and it's so awesome. But then once you learn about the phase, it's like, okay, well, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
So
exactly. So I think it's really cool that like with an app that then it integrates it with them and like their lifestyle and what they're doing. And then it's like, because it is, I think like there's so much with the menstrual cycle that, which we talked about on our PMS episode, is like that kind of notion of like either I'm not motivated, I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough, or I'm crazy because I feel X, Y, Z. And there's so much of that kind of messaging still. I think it's like slowly etching like a little bit lower and lower. But like even if you look at like 2010, like still like things were like, raging PMS women and like all these things. And you're just like, no, that's not actually what, you're not crazy.
No.
Like you might be bloated and pissed off, but you might also just be pissed off because you're just pissed off.
Because you have every right to be.
You've brought up motivation twice now, and so I have to tell you my fun fact. And this will be the last thing, but I learned this the other day, and I'm stoked on it. So dopamine is like your like happy hormone in your brain, right? People talk about that one a lot, and they're like, dopamine, but it also relates to a whole bunch of like other stuff. So like your executive function, so like you're wanting to get, I was about to swear there, but I don't know if we're allowed.
You're totally allowed.
Yeah, you're allowed to swear.
100%.
Getting like shit done, right? Like
Yeah.
it relates to a whole bunch of other things. But estrogen is like this crazy like precursor to dopamine. And so you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so people are always trying to be like, oh, well, like people aren't as, good at school, or it impacts their brains and all this. But nobody's gotten a clear picture. And then somebody put it together that dopamine is in like a curve. It's like you want to be in a sweet spot. It's kind of like a Goldilocks scenario where it's like you can't have too much, you can't have too little. You have to be just right. And so depending on who you are and where your natural dopamine levels sit, your estrogen, when it shows up, is either going to push you into that Goldilocks zone or out of it.
Oh, what?
And no wonder all of the research is conflicting, because they get a group of people and half of them get pushed in and half get pushed out. And they're like, we don't know what it does.
Oh my gosh.
That's so interesting.
That's so
Different
interesting.
people are going to have different, like, amazing, like, feeling great, feeling happy, getting shit done periods during their cycle
Yeah.
than other people because of where they naturally sit.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
That is
so
actually really cool.
And I want to know more about
I know.
it.
I'm like, I'm going to go home and research this.
That's so
is really cool,
interesting.
yeah.
But it's true. It's just like there's so much of that's just like an individual's experience, but it's still just like the more you know.
Yeah, and that could
The more
also
you know.
explain like, oh, okay, well, maybe, it's like, I think it's always about like giving people the power of knowing that they're not just crazy. Like they're not just like, like I said, unmotivated or whatever. It's like, you might just be a type of person that your estrogen, as soon as it comes a knocking, it's just throwing off your
Everything.
levels.
Your other
like-
comes to your body.
yeah,
totally.
And so then therefore you're going to be, more affected in that way, and I'm like, that's the power I want to give people. I just want people to understand that it's not just always like, of course, I'm not saying mental health is not a thing. I'm just saying like there are so many things happening in your body.
Empowering
could
people
be.
to know their body and know
Yeah.
that it's
Yes.
not just in their head, and that
Yeah.
there is a reason behind it, or there could be a reason behind it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
My mom is a
Exactly.
massage therapist, and she always says, like, your body is always talking to you, and you just have to learn how to listen to it. Like,
Yeah.
you need to learn the language. And so many people all over the world, like, we don't know the language of our bodies at all. For whatever reason, maybe that's just like lost knowledge or just like the way that we live now, but it is always trying to tell us stuff. And we would do ourselves and everyone else's service to listen. However, we also need to be able to Google this shit and get some serious answers. Like, we need to have the resources to learn the language.
Yeah.
We did some of the Googling for you, and maybe a little bit step up from Googling. So
Thank
you
you.
can track your motivation in My Normative.
Yes.
See how it shifts for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So coming to that, is there anything that you want to plug? Maybe, obviously the app.
Yeah.
And,
What date did you say, or do you have a rough date of when the new?
My goal is September 1st. It's just like September 1,
wow.
get it done. Yeah.
Okay, so it should definitely, by the time this comes out, it should be, in theory, out there.
Yeah.
That's the big one. It's on the App Store, so it's available for Apple. And version 2 looks so much better. And we've added so much since version 1. So if you were a little iffy on version 1, take a look. If you haven't seen either, you just like get the good stuff right away.
Perfect.
It's awesome. I mean, I think this episode's going to come out.
It'll be like end of September, I'm pretty sure. So
Yeah. So it'll be perfect. It'll be version 2 that people will be going to go check out. So
that's awesome.
so excited.
Renee, thank you so much for
Yeah,
having this
has
conversation and
been
going down the
so
rabbit
great.
holes with us.
Yeah.
We really appreciate everything that you're doing, and we're so happy that everyone knows what an epidemiologist is now.
Yeah. It's wonderful. Actually, is there anywhere like you want to plug for
yeah,
yourself?
if you have any
other
public-
than My Normative?
My Normative Instagram is great. It's my.normative.
That's awesome. No.
Awesome. Well, Renee,
Cool.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is
Thank you
great.
so much. This has been so fun.
Yeah. And lovely to meet you also.
Yeah. Really
You too,
lovely
you
to meet you.
All right.
Awesome.
Have a lovely
good night.
night.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Why So Mysterious is hosted by Sara Jonsdottir and Raven McLean. Audio is produced and edited by Sonia Inke. Original music is by Malcolm Holt and Alexis Young.
Check check out our website, whysomysterious.com, for more information about this episode and other episodes. You can also email us with questions or topics you'd like to hear us cover on the show at whysomysteriousPod@gmail.com.
Follow us on Instagram at whysomysteriouspod for updates, fun facts, and general outrage. If you're an audio listener, but you'd rather be a voyeur, check us out on YouTube.
If you like the show, tell your friends, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Until next time!